Hey guys, it's Jess from Madden Crafts, and today we're going to make some hexagonal marbled coasters using resin. I was so excited when I found out that Mod Podge was coming out with their own line of resin and resin accessories. Thanks to Plaid for sending me some supplies to try out and for sponsoring this video. For this project, I used Mod Podge Resin, their hexagonal coaster mold, which is a silicone mold, mixing cups and stir sticks, and then to color the resin, I used some Mod Podge alcohol ink, which is brand new. I used some Plaid acrylic paint, and I used glitter. You also want to protect your hands with a pair of disposable gloves. I just get mine at the dollar store. You want to start by protecting your work surface. I love using cheap silicone mats for this because cured resin doesn't stick to silicone, so anything can just be peeled right up after you're done. Let's mix some resin. Mod Podge resin is a 1-to-1 epoxy resin, which means you want to mix equal parts of resin and hardener together in order to cause the chemical reaction that will cause the resin to cure. I wanted to have about 3 ounces total resin, which means I needed to carefully measure out 1.5 ounces of resin in one mixing cup and 1.5 ounces of hardener in another cup. It's really important to get these measurements as exact as possible because if you mess up the ratios, the resin might not cure properly. Once you've measured out equal parts of resin and hardener, it's time to mix them together. You want to make sure that you get all of that resin and all of that hardener into another cup and then set a timer for 3 minutes, and you're going to stir the mixture together continuously for 3 minutes. I like to use the voice control on my phone to set that timer to make sure I'm not getting gobs of resin on my phone. While you're stirring the resin and the hardener together, it's important that you scrape the sides of the mixing cup and the bottom to make sure that all of the resin and the hardener are being completely incorporated into each other. Continue to stir slowly but thoroughly until that timer goes off. You want to stir for the entire 3 minutes. After you've finished stirring, set the cup of resin aside and let it sit for about 2 to 3 minutes to let any bubbles rise to the surface and pop. It's at this point that you can choose to color your resin. I divided my resin up into 4 different measuring cups and I added alcohol ink to one of them. Mod Podge has a new line of alcohol inks. They come in 2 packs in a wide range of colors. My recommendation with alcohol ink and resin is always start with a drop or 2 and then slowly add more to achieve the color that you want. You can always add more ink, but you can't take it out once it's in there. Alcohol ink will color your ink and leave it transparent. If you want a more opaque look, you can add in acrylic paint, which means your entire stash of craft paint can now be used to color resin. I mixed some gold glitter and some gold treasure gold paint in this small mixing cup. Remember, because the acrylic paint makes the resin opaque, you won't be able to see glitter quite as much in paint colored resin as you will in the ink colored resin. I created shimmery black resin by mixing in black color shift paint into this mixing cup. To add even more dimension to my final product, I left this batch of resin clear and mixed in some teal glitter. Finally, for my largest portion of resin, I mixed together a custom color using 2 different shades of acrylic paint. Before you start your resin pour, you need to make sure that your work surface is completely level. Resin is self-leveling, and so if your molds aren't level, your finished project isn't going to be either. Now it was time to add my resin to the silicone molds. If you are using molds for the first time, it's always a good idea to wash them thoroughly with soap and water and then to get them completely dry before you start working. Little by little, I drizzled my resin into the silicone molds. With coaster molds like this, it's important to remember that the very first resin that you put into the mold is going to be visible on the top of the coaster once it's all finished. So this is where you really want to start to be laying out any kind of marbling design that you hope to see in the end product. Whatever resin is left at the top while you're doing the resin pour is just going to be the bottom of the coaster. It'll still be pretty, but it won't be as visible. I wanted my coasters to have a kind of marbled look to them, so I created streaks and stripes of the various colors, going back and forth and only using a small amount of resin at a time to make sure that all of the colors were visible in my final project. When you're working with resin like this, it's important to remain a little bit forgiving with yourself, because no matter how hard you try, you are not going to be in complete control in what the final project looks like. And that's actually the really fun part. So let your creativity out. Try not to be so controlling. That's hard for me too. And enjoy as the resin kind of melds and works with itself and creates cool patterns and textures. I continued to pour my resin into the silicone molds until they were nearly full. You want to make sure that your silicone molds are pretty full in order to get the project to work properly, but do not overfill them or you will have a big mess on your hands. Once you've finished your resin pour, you can use a torch, a heat gun, or a long-armed lighter like I did to pop any bubbles that rise to the surface. The heat from the flame or from the heat gun will cause those bubbles to pop, and then the resin will self-level to kind of heal up that bubble. There's a pretty long work time with Mod Podge Resin, so I suggest that you come back every hour or so for the first couple of hours to redo this step and pop any more bubbles that may have risen to the surface of the resin. Then cover your project and let it cure for at least 24 hours. After the 24 hours are up, you can carefully stretch the resin mold to pop your coasters out of the mold. The resin will still be pliable at this point, so don't stretch or bend it too much or you might distort the shape of your coasters. Once the coasters have been popped out of the mold, let them sit for another 3 to 7 days to fully cure, and then the resin will be completely hardened and super durable. And here are my finished coasters. I'm really happy with how they turned out. They're going to match my family room perfectly, and they almost have kind of like an elegant camo look going on. I'm really happy with how they turned out. Half of the fun of doing a resin project is the big reveal when you remove the project from the mold, and it's something that I look forward to every time. Give this video a thumbs up if you learned something new, subscribe to my channel if you aren't already, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and visit me on my blog, madandcrafts.com. Bye!